Hi everyone, and welcome to part 3 of our Promised Land series. We've been working through the book of Joshua over the last couple of weeks, and we'll do for 2 weeks after this. Today we land in Joshua 3 and 4, and we pick up the story at this crucial moment. If you're unfamiliar with the story, of course, I encourage you to go and have a read of it. We're not going to read the whole 2 chapters here at this moment, but do go have a read of it. But in essence, the people have come out the wilderness, they're moving towards the promised land, and then they hit this huge body of water that's between them and stepping into the very promise that God has got for them, the fulfillment of an ancient promise in this piece of land that God has set aside for them. And then we're just going to pick up how they get across this river that was in flood to the other side, this miraculous moment in this wonderful story. We call it the dry crossing because that's what God does. In this book so far, we've picked up the sort of meta-narrative of the book, which is that God is a God of the covenant. He's a God that promises to his people. And God is not just a God of promise, God is a God of faithfulness. He covenants and then he delivers on that faithfulness. And that's kind of the big arc over the top of this story that we find encapsulated in Joshua's book. And we're going to pull out some bits. And today, we do this a couple of times throughout the year, just to gather the church, go like, this is where we're heading. So we're going to use this story to really help us look at what does the next few months look like for us as a body? What does it look like? Where are we going? I've hit that moment in my life, that midlife moment where my eyesight is not what it was. And it's really frustrating. I was out for dinner the other evening with Catherine and trying to read a menu in the darkness of a restaurant, a nicely lit restaurant, but it was just and had to hold the menu further and further away, and then eventually had to get the light on my phone onto the menu to try and read it, and that was still not solving the problem. So Catherine suggested I took a picture of it, so I had to take a picture and then expand it. It was so frustrating. I felt so debilitated, and not knowing where we're heading can be like that. So we hope through this story today and these coming months in front of us that you'll see where we're going and what the journey ahead looks like for us. Joshua, right at the very end of this story, declares this in Joshua 23:14. He says, "Every promise has been fulfilled. Not one has failed." So Joshua, as he looks at his life and looks at this story, reaffirms what we've set out as the meta-narrative over this story, that God's a God of the covenant and God is faithful. And he helped us in the last bit to look backwards. Sometimes we need to look backwards at the faithfulness of God in the past and almost scoop that and grab that in our faith and in our being and in our consciousness, and that can help us look forward. We grab what we've seen and what we know of God from the past, and we can get hold of it and help us look forward. And Andy helped us see even the enemies of Israel, the people of God, even they remembered how powerful God was, as Andy took us through that conversation with Rahab as the spies went to Jericho to have a look round. Well, today is this landmark moment. It's this moment where the covenant starts to really, for the first time, get fulfilled. This covenant taken from Abraham in Genesis 12. It's an ancient promise that God spoke over Abraham's life. And just to pick up one thread of that, because we're going to race through this stuff this morning, in Genesis 12:7, this is how it reads. And this is God speaking to Abraham. This is God's promise to Abraham. "To your offspring I will give this land." So he built an altar there to the Lord who had appeared before him. To your offspring, to your children, to your children's children's children, as we'll find out in a bit, and beyond, I will promise to give you this bit of land, which turns out in this context to be a place called Canaan. The Jordan was the sort of dividing piece between the promised land and the wilderness. which is where we arrive with our feet on the edge of the river bank today. This promise of Abraham was actually 700 years before. And I know that clashes into our culture. I know that clashes into our thinking because we live in an instant world, don't we? If something doesn't work instantly, we're frustrated. If we go to a drive-through and if you have to pull up into the waiting bay of shame and wait for about 4 minutes instead of the 1 minute, if you're anything like me, you find yourself frustrated because it should be instant. Or if your broadband crashes, you get frustrated because everything should be there and it should be working. But the way God works through time is eternal. His lens and view is different to ours. We obviously have the understanding of eternity, but God lives in that reality of eternity. And this promise had waited 700 years until its moment of fulfillment. Just have a think about the things that God has spoken to you, the things that are anchored in the Bible that God has spoken to all of us, the promises to all of us, but maybe even some of the specifics that God's spoken to you over the years. Are you in it for the long haul? Are you ready to wait for God's timing to be perfect in your life before things open, or do we move on because it hasn't happened in an instant? There's a big challenge to our culture in that. So God promised, but then God speaks that same promise over Joshua. Right at the beginning, Joshua 1:3, God says this, I will give you every place where you set your foot, as I promised Moses. So the promise has gone from Abraham to Moses, and then God speaks it personally over Joshua as the leader of that group, those 12 tribes in that moment. But before their feet go from the riverbank into the promised land and the other riverbank, the opposite riverbank, there is a problem. And the problem and the challenge is the River Jordan. And it's not just a river that's kind of nice that you could go through and wade through in ankle deep on a refreshing summer's day. This is a river, as it tells us, in flood season. Take a look at this crazy picture, a recent contemporary picture of the River Jordan in flood season. As you can see, that is completely impassable. It's a raging torrent of water that would sweep away anything. I think that tree that's in that image is in danger. Will it survive the Jordan in flood season? So there was still a huge hurdle. They were there, but they weren't quite there. A couple of years ago, I ran the Chichester Half Marathon to raise money for Life Centre, an amazing charity based here in Chichester, but working across the whole of Sussex, working with people who've been through sexual abuse and sexual trauma, people who've had unwanted sexual experiences, helping them reconstruct their lives, pull their lives back together through a number of different therapeutic services. And I decided I was going to run that to raise money for them. They are incredible, and I thought that's something I can do. Half marathon, as you well know, is just over 12 miles. Have you ever walked, to those of you familiar with Chichester, Centurion's Way? It's just the most beautiful walk from the kind of western end of Chichester right up to Lavant, to the bottom of the Downs. It's a beautiful walk. When you're that far through, that was the final piece of this half marathon. It went on forever. Now, it is less than 2 miles, but it went on forever because it was the last little bit. And I wonder whether the people here in this moment felt that way, felt it's the last tiny few steps, but oh my goodness, there's so much still to be done before our feet can touch onto this land, this ancient promised land that God has covenanted to us, his people. This river as well, there was a lot of history there with the nation of Israel, with the 12 tribes. There were moments where bodies of water had been very significant. You remember right at the very beginning in the creation narrative found in Genesis, the waters are very significant in that creative narrative. And to this day, we know that 2/3 of our planet that we inhabit is water. But water and bodies of water come up time and time again through the scripture, kind of unsurprisingly, knowing just that ratio of land to water. But we see miraculous moments with water before. We see the people of God escape slavery, hundreds and hundreds of years, 400 odd years of slavery from the Egyptians. And again, a similar story. They kind of escape through miraculous provision. They find themselves at the edge of the Red Sea, and it's impassable. But God splits the sea, and the people of God, the tribes, are able to escape through this dried passageway through this sea. The water was held back on both sides, and the people of God managed to get across in this incredible, miraculous moment. And then the armies chasing them, the Egyptians chasing them, the water came back as they tried to cross that same place too. We've seen miraculous splitting of sea. This is a different body of water, but we've also seen this body of water appears in the scripture too. This is the same body of water that Elijah, when Elijah died, Elisha picked up Elijah's cloak and hit the body of water with it, which was the River Jordan. And guess what? In that moment, the Jordan split, and Elisha was able to walk across it. And there was something deeply powerful in that kind of resonates with our story today. Elisha started on one side of the Jordan as just a member of the band of prophets, although he'd been commissioned by Elijah to be more than that. By the time he walked across that river and his feet touched the other side, he transferred from one side to the other as a different man, as a different person. He was now the major prophetic voice over that oppressed people. He was someone different when he arrived on the other side. Now, these stories are deliberately written so there are echoes and reverberations throughout the Bible. And when we read one story, we are at times deliberately provoked to think about other stories and similarities. And yes, there are differences. As I said, there was a different body of water in Exodus as they came out and into the freedom from the emancipation. But there's phrases that get used time and time again. In Joshua 3:16, in this moment, in these two chapters that we're in today, he uses this phrase. The phrase that he uses is that the water is heaped up. Now, I don't know about you, but I've never heard water described that way, as being heaped up. It just seems a bizarre phraseology, but it was heaped up to allow the safe passage. Now, that's exactly the same phrase that is used in Exodus 14 as they go through the Red Sea. So we are meant to get the overlaps here. We're meant to get the familiar stories, but there are definite differences that go on here. This is a moment of covenant fulfillment. The Red Sea was a moment of emancipation. It was a moment of freedom. It was a moment where people were no longer held captive. This is a different moment. This is a moment of fulfillment, of a spectacular covenant. Old Testament scholar, one of the Old Testament scholars who I've read, Creech, he describes it this way. What happened on one side of the bank to when their feet arrived on the other side of the bank was this. It turned a wandering band of people into a nation. They were different when they reached the other side. Something significant had happened, and they were walking in a very different way on the other side of the river as their dry feet walked upon the other riverbank. It was a sealing of a miraculous promise that spanned 700 years. No longer were they slaves, but they were now people who had a home. They were people who could put down roots and could live the fulfillment of that covenant promise, that God would bless this people group in order that every person on the face of the planet could be blessed by God through these people. Having somewhere to be and live made that so much more easy and so much more tangible and within reach for them. This was the land of milk and honey. It wasn't just a bit of wasteland somewhere out there. This was a rich land that God had promised to his people. There were still massive challenges ahead, and we'll pick up on those in the coming weeks. It wasn't that when they stepped into this land that they just got to be on one lifelong holiday where life was easy and life was straightforward. There were still battles to be fought. And some of those were substantive battles where they were completely outnumbered, outgunned, outexperienced, outnumbered. Like, it was just crazy, but God was with them as they faced those battles in this new promised land. So as they moved from living in wilderness into living in the promised land, there's a few keys that I feel are even relevant to us today in 2021. I don't know about you, but this last 18 months has in many ways felt like living in wilderness. It's felt like living in a sort of bit of a wasteland, a desert, and it's not been straightforward. I'd certainly say that's the case for my family, grappling with things like Catherine and I both trying to work full-time and homeschool our children through exams and GCSEs. It's been hard work. Leading organizations through this season has been a big challenge. But it's the same for businesses. I was talking to a local businessman just a couple of days ago, and he talked about how hard it had been during that first lockdown to be running a business that you can't do anything. You can't see people. His business was there in physical structure and in legislation, but he couldn't do any work and he couldn't earn any money. How challenging it was to lead a small business through that. And we've seen big businesses through this season just not able to cope. Right in this moment, we're seeing energy companies crumble at this moment, this last couple of weeks, because they can't cope with the tensions that are going on economically at this moment. Schools have been in the wilderness. They've had to figure new things out, find new ways of living and being, and in many ways just surviving. How do they help our children and young people from the smallest infant school in reception through to the university and higher education system, further education system? It's been a challenging 18 months. The government have faced a challenging 18 months, having to work out how to lead a nation through a pandemic that hadn't really been done before, certainly not in modern times. And I'm sure history will look back and go, do you know what, that bit, we wouldn't do it like that again. It didn't work brilliantly, and we've learned a lot. But there will be bits that we look back at and go, our government did a great job in that moment. But there are stretch across our government, and we've seen that on our news. But churches too were not immune from this. If you're part of this church, you'll know that some of the pain of this last 18 months has been very real and very tangible and just sad and frustrating, as we've had to make adjustments to our structures and the way we do things. And we've even had to reduce our expenditure through some of our staffing as well as in other areas. It's been hard. We've had to try and survive this period. It's been about surviving and not being overwhelmed and crumpled and squashed down. Within the church life, it's not just been about survival. I don't want you to think that we've just kind of been holding there. God's been kind and gracious. And in this period that I'd probably describe mainly as survival season, new things have come to life. New things have been born, as this was for the people in the wilderness. New children were born. Provision did come in miraculous ways through the manna that was provided, their daily food, their daily water that was provided to them. We've seen Love Chichester come alive. That didn't exist. That's our work looking to support families in Chichester. We've taken on 30 families in Chichester that can't afford to regularly put fresh fruit and vegetables on their meal plans throughout the week. And as a church, you guys, we have spectacularly risen to that challenge of feeding those 30 families with fresh fruit and veg once a month, a huge delivery. We've seen Sparklers, our new stay and stay and play toddler group come alive. All the other toddler groups in the area had sort of shut and gone dormant, certainly in the part of Chichester where our building is. There's some starting to reappear now, but there's nothing in the ward that we're in Chichester. So we've started something, and it's been an amazing, overwhelming success. Even in its embryonic state, we are fully booked with people coming through the door. Our student program, one of my great joys through this challenging season, has seen the commitment of students at the University of Chichester to come and want to be part of this body, come and want to play their part, get stuck in, get involved. That has been a huge pleasure. The posture of survival is an interesting one. How do you survive? I don't know, when you're down the beach, down at the Witterings, and a big wave, if you've ever been in on a wavy day, and a big wave is about to hit, you have to widen your base, right? So you don't get knocked off your feet. Your feet have to come, and you have to sometimes lean into the wave that's about to hit you. And you might have to duck under the water. You might hold your head. There's a way of being when the waves are big. There's a way of being, our body posture, when we are trying to survive something. There's a way of being in our emotions when we're trying to survive something. There's a way of being in our spirituality when we're trying to survive something. And none of those things are bad. But we can't live like that throughout our lives. We can't live in survival mode. I want to challenge us as we step into this next few months that we need to step out of that posture of survival, and we need to step into a new posture in our thinking, in our physical being, how we welcome people, how we care for people, how we share Jesus with people, that is about going back to our posture as it should be, which is one of thriving. So rather than surviving, we need to change gear into thriving through this season. If you're down the Witterings on a day where it's flat and calm and the sun shines out, we were down there just a few days ago. Going in the water is very different. You might even sort of lie on the water and float and put your hands back and you'll relax. Your posture is very, very different. Your mentality is very different. Your enjoyment is very, very different. We're called to be a group of people. The church with the big C, globally, was always postured to thrive, even in the face of adversity. And that doesn't mean there aren't wilderness moments. That doesn't mean there aren't battles, but we are called to thrive. I want to encourage us through this next season that we need to reshape our posture. As people come through the door, we've had an incredible amount of people come join us for the first time in the last 3 months. Through a season where we're normally fairly quiet through the summer, we've been busy welcoming new people into 104. In that 3-month period alone, we've seen 20 new adults come through the front door for the first time. Now, if our posture of welcoming people when we're on survival mode might be a bit more cagey of, yeah, come in, but be careful. Do you kind of see what I mean? Our posture when we're in thrive mode, mentality and being and spiritualities, come in, it's great to see you. How can I welcome you today? Is it an elbow, a fist bump, a hug? What is it you're after today? But it's very, very different. And thriving mode allows new things to come. It allows new things to flourish and come to life that can't when we're just surviving. So I want to pull 3 things out for us to think about as we step out of surviving and into thriving in this new season from this wonderful story. The first thing is this. Joshua 3:10 says this, that our God is the living God. There's this moment where you will know it says the living God is amongst you. God's not distant, God's close with us. And one of the ways that we live as followers of Christ is with a great knowledge, knowing that the living God, not the distant God, but the living God is with us. And the new covenant promise created and won through Christ and his cross, his resurrection and his ascension, means that the Holy Spirit is with us in everything, in all times? Do we live in a thriving way like the living God is with us? We just had a wonderful week of prayer, and in moments in that prayer room that I've had, physically being in the prayer room, but also praying at home some of the time, where I've known the living God is with me, and it shifts my mentality hugely. The second thing, I want to remind us of what Andy said the last session we had on this subject. We need to look back at what God's done. Let's look back at the amazing things that God's done with this community over nearly 40 years, this Revelation Family Church. And even in recent years, the wonder of 104 that's come into place. Completely miraculously, God has done an amazing thing with us. Let's look back at that, allow our faith to be filled with that. Let's grab a scoopful hold of it or a bucket load of it, and let's use that as we start to now walk into our future, that God has operated and been like that to us. He's been faithful, and therefore will be as we move forward. There's a power in our remembering of what he's already done. And the third thing is this. The people crossed the water together. They didn't do it kind of one tribe got all the way to the other side, and then a couple of days later, the next tribe went. The 12 tribes and the diversity of those 12 tribes all came together to cross together. So we want to encourage you and ourselves that we want to be people that do something together. We want to cross through the space, the path that God makes for us, the miraculous path that God makes for us throughout our lives, with the water heaped up on either side, that we walk through that together. And as we walk through it in this story together, we remember, and going back to the previous point, that moment of remembering what God's done. And we see that happen in this story as they each bent down and picked up, they sent people to pick up these 12 stones from the middle of the Jordan to be set up at Gilgal, to always remember that God had the covenanted God had been faithful to what he'd promised. So the challenge as we run into these next few months is this, and there will be battles, there will be challenges in front of us. This isn't going to be kind of a summer holiday, but we've got to get into a thrive mentality and take off the clothes of the survival of this last 18 months. We've got to welcome in new people, and in order to welcome in new people and still be sensible around how we manage the virus that's still around, we are going to have to be launching a second gathering to get everyone through the doors. The last few weeks, we have been full to capacity in here with the implementation of those safety measures that we've got in place to minimize the risk of the infection spreading amongst us as a people group. We want to be able to welcome new people. We don't want to have to say to people, sorry, we're full today, you can't come. So although there's loads of questions, there's huge stretches on teams, on children's teams, on hospitality teams, on worship teams. There's huge stretch that's going to come. We've got to get ready to launch a second morning gathering, and we need you to be part of that. We need to gather together for those of us who feel safe enough to do that. Now, we will still be broadcasting online, so don't panic if it isn't a moment for you to come out just yet for the reasons that are in front of you. But we need to step into that. So in this next month, that is what we're going to be doing. Do we have all the answers? Do we have all the equipment? No, we don't. Do we have all the people? No, we don't. But we've got to thrive, and we've got to be in that mindset, and we've got to step forward trusting that the riverbank will stay dry under our feet as we cross through it. Alpha is coming up. We want to be a church that grows. Take that thriving mentality into conversations with friends and family and work colleagues, that there is a God that loves them. Love Chichester. There are more than 30 families in Chichester that need help. Can we grow that? Can we step further than we have already gone before? The wonderful resource that is 104, man, God gave us such a clear vision to create a space for those to come and rest with us, people to find home and peace and sanctuary here, people to be fed, people to be looked after, people to be clothed, people to be cared for, particularly those on the margins of our society, those whose lives are really complicated. Have we been able to deliver that? No, we haven't because of the pandemic, but Has God set this in motion? Yes, he has. He's planted that mustard seed in this body of people, and it's growing, even though it isn't the fully sort of fledged tree that we hoped it would be by now. It's growing, and the vision is that the branches will provide shelter, rest, and food for those that need it in our community. What's the challenge to you then? What's the challenge to me? Get stuck in, roll your sleeves up. Get stuck in and roll your sleeves up in a way that you can. If you're not able to do that in person at the minute, there's plenty of ways that you can still get stuck in with things like Love Chichester. There's many other areas. If you want to have some ideas, then email us in, mail@revelation.org.uk, and we can give you plenty. If you're in person, then we ask you to come and help us welcome this flow of new people into this church, into this family. 20 new people in 3 months have come through the doors. We all need to be those that welcome those people into this community. So get yourselves here. Your resources, invest in what we're doing. We still face challenging and uncertain times financially. Invest into the kingdom through this beautiful mechanism. The primary agent of that kingdom is the church. The manifold wisdom of God is found in the church. Invest your time, your most precious gift, your time, but also your resources into it. Start small if you've never started before, but get moving in that. Roll your sleeves up and get stuck in. So God is faithful. He's the covenant God who is faithful. We can look back at what he's done, and we take the bucket load of that into our future to be encouraged as we go forward. And let's journey together. The church is the most amazing, unique organization or institution on the face of the planet. It is like no other. People from all walks of life coming together behind one central person, the person of Jesus Christ. The diversity, the rich tapestry that is the church, that is incomparable to anything else we find in society. Come get stuck in, come play your part, come join in as the Lord leads us out of that wilderness place, across the dry riverbed, and our feet stand and then start to walk on the promised land that is before us. Thanks for listening today. If you want to find out more, then do get in touch with us. Let us know. We'd love to help you really roll your sleeves up and get stuck in. But let's remember, as we have through this whole series, that God is the God who covenants. He promises, and he's faithful.